My name is Joshua Foxworth. In this video, I'm going to use the example of the Orion space program to demonstrate how DEI and other policies have absolutely devastated the space program. I'm going to do this in three parts. In the first part, I'm going to lay out some metrics that show just how bad things have gotten on the Orion program. In the second part, I'm explaining how DEI is actually implemented at NASA because it's different than what you would expect. In the third part, I'm going to walk you through my time as a structural engineer on the Orion program. And what you can see as I do this is that NASA and its contractors and subcontractors use state and federal laws with respect to race to create a culture of fraud and abuse based largely on race. Now, fraud is my word. It's not the technical definition. I think you're going to agree as I walk you through these examples that yes, it is fraud. So they have entirely separate policies with respect to ethics, hiring, termination for white males as opposed to everybody else. These policies are then used to cover up fraud. And the examples I'm going to give you is how multiple systems on the Orion program were brought through one of the early design reviews, the preliminary design review, with absolutely zero mathematical basis. Before I get started, I want to say that when I left the space program, I did file a complaint with the NASA Office of Inspector General. I told them everything I'm going to tell you now. They went and did an investigation, and what they got back to me and stated was that not NASA, not Lockheed, not my subcontractor, and I'll explain what that is in a minute, nobody denied a single thing I said. Everyone just completely said, yes, those things happened. Yes, again, what I would call fraud. Yes, they did these things. Apparently, since they did not lie to the Office of Inspector General, it's kind of a no harm, no foul situation. It was sort of deemed as a contracting dispute between Lockheed and NASA. Nevertheless, my situation went unresolved, so I left the space program because of it. But I want to make that clear. The things I'm laying out here is not my word against NASA. It's not my word against Lockheed. Nothing I've said here was denied by anyone. So let's get started. And the first part here is metrics. We're going to look primarily at two things. The first thing being money spent. Obviously, you have to look at that within your government project. The second thing we're going to look at is what I'm calling time to first man launch. So that's how much time passed between the first dollar spent and the first man launch of a vehicle. Now, we're talking mostly about Orion, and Orion is a modern day capsule. So we're only going to compare it to previous capsules. So we're not going to directly compare it to the space shuttle or the space station because those are just largely different projects and sort of their own kind of beasts. But we do have a number of historical and modern day examples to compare it to. All right, so I do have a few notes here I'm going to reference, but largely these numbers are ballparked. When we're talking about money, every dollar I'm giving you here has been inflation adjusted up to 2024. So we're comparing apples to apples here. So let's just walk through chronologically. We're going to start with Mercury, the first capsule program. Started in 1958, a little less than 3 years to go from first dollar spent to first man in space. Total cost a little less than $3 billion. Now, Mercury was pretty simple and compared to what was done later. The next step was Gemini. Gemini, from first dollar spent to first manned launch, was a little over 3 years, so roughly the same amount of time. Gemini did some more stuff in orbit, though, and was a little more expensive, being about $10 billion overall. From there, we went to Apollo. Now, Apollo was a massive step up in everything, in technology and just sheer amounts that were launching in space. It took about 7 years to go from first dollar spent to first man launch. Again, about twice as long as previously done. Total money spent. Now, I'm only talking about the capsule portion of Apollo. Apollo had landers, rovers, boosters. I'm only comparing capsules to capsules, but the total money spent on the Apollo capsule was about $43 billion. Again, that's adjusted for roughly $2,024. From there, we built the shuttle, we built the station, so we had a good while without building any capsules. Some modern day comparisons can be SpaceX. Now, SpaceX did get to cheat a little bit. They originally got to build a capsule that went from the ground to the station with no people on it. It's purely a supply capsule. That started in 2006. Took about 4 years to go from nothing to their first flight. Again, that's not a manned flight because this was a totally unmanned vehicle. The cost is a little bit difficult to grasp, but a few $1 billion roughly, somewhere around $45 billion, and that was Dragon 1. Next, they got to build Dragon 2, which was their first manned vehicle. Again, they took about 6 years for completion. They've flown 14, 15 manned missions so far. Again, it's a little difficult to judge exactly how much this costs, but somewhere between $3 and $5 billion. All right, so that's 2 capsules in modern times for SpaceX, each costing around $5 billion and each taking about 6 years to go from nothing to first flight or first manned flight. We can look at Boeing Starliner. Now, this capsule became somewhat infamous recently because it got astronauts stuck on the station. That's a bit of a misconception, but they did push things a little bit. This was a different kind of contract. It took them about 10 years to go from first dollar spent to their first manned launch recently. But they only spent about $5 billion on this, a lot less money. Like I said, it's an out-cost type of contract, so it's a little bit different than everything else. Incidentally, that 10 years was viewed as a very long time, and that was one of the things that pressured them to launch, despite the fact that they had some minor malfunctions. So that's our longest time, is 10 years and about $5 billion. So we can now jump over to Orion. Orion, as of today, has been going for about 19 years of funding. They have not yet launched a manned vehicle. They plan to do so in 2025, supposedly, but that's 19 years without a manned flight. Again, it took SpaceX 6 years to develop one. It took Boeing 10 years to develop one, and that was considered to be largely a failure because it took so long. In the old days, it took 3 years to go from nothing to launch, and Apollo took 7 years. They're at 19 years, and they still haven't launched a manned vehicle yet. So you might say, okay, well, maybe they're just not spending money on it. Well, actually, they've spent over $30 billion on it at this point. Again, step back and look at Boeing. They spent $5 billion, and that's considered, they're a cost overrun. And you're at $30 billion in 19 years with the Orion, and you haven't launched a person into space yet. Step back a little bit and think about this. From the start of Mercury, all the way through Mercury, all the way through Gemini, and all the way through Apollo, that's the entirety of all 3 of those programs, from nothing to the end of the moon missions, was 14 to 15 years. And we're at 19 years with Apollo, and we haven't launched a man yet. In the first 19, 20 years of the shuttle program, we built several shuttles, and they're massive, and we launched about 40 missions. And in the first 19 years of this program, they haven't launched a man yet. That is astonishing to me. So when I talk about the environment on the Orion vehicle and its design, talk about how bad things were, and I give you some of these examples, you're going to step back and say, this is just not possible, because this would be completely and totally unsuccessful if this was actually true. Well, 19 years and $30 billion without a man launched into space is a complete and total failure. I don't care if they launch tomorrow, this would be a failure. So I know what I'm going to describe to you is very bad, but this is bad. The 19 years and $30 billion plus is really, really bad. Okay, so part 2. Now that I've shown you how long and how much money has been spent on Orion with almost nothing in return, let's talk about how DEI is actually implemented at NASA. So there is the standard DEI. There are people who are hired who probably shouldn't be because of their race and gender. There are definitely people who are stepped over because they're not the proper race and gender. These things happen. I don't want to discount that. But the primary problem at NASA is what we call subcontracting. So decades ago, the federal government decided that a certain portion of every dollar spent had to go to a minority-owned business. Well, you can't just break apart pieces of a project like Orion and give it to companies. Even if you could, those companies don't exist. So the solution was what we call subcontracting. And what subcontracting is you basically take spots, you take jobs on something like the Orion, and you say, these belong to a minority-owned company. And what those companies are is basically shells. There might be 2 or 3 people that actually work for them, and they just handle the paperwork of the employees. But they're staffing agencies. They exist on paper. They don't do anything. If you are somebody who works for those subcontractors for the Orion project for Lockheed Martin, you interview with Lockheed Martin bosses. You go to Lockheed Martin buildings. You do what is presumably the same job as a Lockheed Martin engineer would do. You just don't actually work for Lockheed Martin. You work for the subcontracting company. The subcontracting company that I worked for was called GHG. So I'm going to reference that. If I slip into saying GHG instead of subcontracting, that's what I'm talking about. So I don't think it really comes across how bad this situation is. So let me give you an analogy. Imagine you have a police department, and the police department decides, for whatever reason, we need to have a certain number of a certain race of people, but you don't have those applicants. So you go and find usually a disabled minority female veteran, and you say, you know what, you can create a company that's a staffing agency, and we will interview and hire our cops, but they will actually work for you. You get a cut of their money. And since we can say this is a cost-saving thing, we will pay them less. So it saves us money, you get to get your cut, and we don't owe these employees anything. So just imagine that for a second. Those cops work the same job as a regular cop. They get less pay. They have no future whatsoever. There is no ladder for them to climb because they're only occupying that spot. Now imagine that the police department decides, you know what, we're going to start protecting our own people, and we're going to send these subcontracting cops out to walk the jobs that nobody really wants to walk. And we're going to do the cool stuff. We're going to do the easy stuff, the glamorous stuff. Now, sooner or later, you're not going to get people that are willing to work those cop jobs, because why would you work as a subcontracting cop with no future and less pay when you can go to a different police department? Or you can just do a different job. Well, that's where the analogy breaks down, because at NASA, if you're someone like me who gets a master's degree in aerospace engineering, you can't just go to a different space program. It doesn't exist. So what has typically happened is you have very, very qualified people come into the space program, do a lot of work over 2 or 3 years, and then look around and go, there's no future for me here. And they walk away. A lot of them do stay because they love working on the space program. They are very good engineers. But unfortunately, stepping back away from that analogy now, in the space program, not only do you not have a future, but if you are a subcontractor to a contractor like Lockheed Martin for NASA, say you're working on the Orion program. Now, most of them don't last 19, 20 years. So every 6, 7, 8 years, that project ends and you are out of a job. You have to go find another job as a subcontractor in a different company. And all the while you're doing this, you have other engineers who are hired, who are promoted, working their way up the chain of command at Lockheed or Boeing or any of these other companies. And you're sitting there doing the work that they're doing in many cases. Maybe you're doing work that they're not capable of doing. The way I saw this play out at Lockheed Martin, and I'm not saying this plays out everywhere, this is just what I saw in my experience. The way it played out at Lockheed Martin is that they hired what they call technical people. People like me. I got a master's degree. I was a finite element structural analysis guy. They hire us to do the actual design and analysis work, and the vast majority of Lockheed Martin people refer to themselves as non-technical people. Now, they were engineers, they had engineering degrees, but they didn't do the design and analysis. They did management. Now, let me just step back for a second and explain how things are supposed to work at NASA and quite frankly, at most companies. You are a junior engineer. You come in, you work, you have a mentor, someone who guides you, someone who has done that work before. It's probably your manager. You do a few projects. You then become a somewhat senior guy. The new guys come in. You mentor them. If there is a problem, that junior guy can come to you. If you haven't seen that stuff before, you have someone else you can go to that's seen that before. The phrase is institutional memory, and it is what allowed NASA to go from Mercury to Gemini to Apollo as fast as they did. Because they learned from their mistakes. They learned how to do things, and they trained the new people coming in on their mistakes. It's how we were able to actually build the shuttle and the space station. This subcontracting that we've got going on at NASA now, it's been going on for decades, absolutely destroys this. Because the guys that come in and do the actual work, they don't get raised up as managers. And so when you come in as a subcontractor, you might be given an extremely technical task, and you might be a junior engineer, but you're a technical guy. You can't go to your manager and say, hey, can you give me some help with this? Because your manager's never done that before, because they're a manager, they're not an actual engineer. So you're going to see some examples of this as I walk you through the third part here. So I hope that's clear enough of what subcontracting is. So part 3, I'll walk you through my time as a structural engineer at NASA. So I was hired initially to work on what was called the Crew Impact Attenuation System. It was a subcontracting role through a company called GHG. I interviewed with a man named Kurt Miller, who ran what was called the mechanisms group, and the crew impact attenuation system was one of those mechanisms. I interviewed with Kurt. He hired me. I filed paperwork with GHG. This is the one time I met them, throughout most of this process. I'm going to refer to the CIS, the Crew Impact Attenuation System, as a CIS. Now, what that was a series of a few rods and what they call a pallet, which is just a slab of metal. The crew's chairs attached to this pallet. It had two purposes. The primary purpose was that on launch of a vehicle, the rocket shakes the capsule a lot. If you shake at a certain frequency spectrum, like 10 to 12 hertz, it does damage to people. So you have to attenuate, you have to stop those vibrations from getting to the crew. That was the main thing. The secondary thing was that on a hard impact, it would crumple and absorb some of the shock. That's an off-nominal impact. I can't really put into words how happy and excited I was to go to work on this project. I went to school for 7 years, get a master's degree in aerospace engineering. Before that, I had to go through 4 years of military service just to get the money and the ability to go to college. College was not a fun thing for me. I had to work. I was going up against kids that, quite frankly, had a far, far better high school education than me. I had so many days in the first couple of years where I didn't sleep at night. I was passing out on campus. I had to decide between food and electricity, and it was not a fun time for me. To go through all of that and to then be told, okay, you can work on the space program, but not as a NASA engineer. And you can work in a space program, but not even as a Lockheed Martin employee. You can work as a subcontractor to the contractor to NASA. That was a bit off-putting, but my thought process was, I'll get in there, I'll do a good job, and they'll hire me, as a Lockheed Martin employee eventually. My expectation was that everybody else working on this would be a vibrations or structural analysis person just like me. Like I said, I was absolutely thrilled to do this. This is exactly what I wanted to do for over a decade. When I was brought in, they had just gone through what we call PDR, which is preliminary design review. That's one of the early milestones that any large project like this goes through. So I get in there, there's 4 or 5 guys working on it. I learned within the first couple of days that I was the only one that had an advanced degree. I was the only one that had like a finite element background, and I was quite taken aback by that, to be honest. I asked them to give me what they got. They gave me a PowerPoint presentation, which is what they had, what they used in their PDR review that they'd gone through like 2 weeks before. It was long. It was like 300 something slides. Took me a few days to go through it. In that presentation were screen captures of what we call FEMAP, which is a finite element analysis. So they had done analysis. There were screen captures of the CAD model. They were math results that only come from calculation, like weights down to tenths and hundredths of a pound. Those only come from calculations. You don't just say, oh, it's roughly 30 pounds. So then I began to ask, all right, well, give me the math that got you here. Let me have a FEMAP license. Let me see that. I started asking questions like, how did you decide on this design? How did you get here, basically? And no one would give me a straight answer on literally anything. So after a week or two of this, I sat down with the guy that was running that particular project and said, hey, you need to give me deliverables. I need to know what it is you want me to do here, because it doesn't seem like you have anything for me to do. What came out of that meeting was him telling me to take the high-level documents of requirements for everything and start breaking them out into an Excel spreadsheet, which is fine if that's what you want me to do. But it really started to feel like they did not have a mathematical basis for what they had done. I began to ask questions like, how did you do this finite element analysis if nobody here knows how to do finite element analysis? And what I realized was that they'd basically farmed this work out to a subcontractor and then got rid of that subcontractor. So I was a bit put off by this, but like I said, I was super excited to work on it. Nothing was going to dampen my enthusiasm for this. After being there about 6 to 8 weeks, a guy I had never met before comes over to my cubicle and says that he and I are switching positions. And I was like, no, I just got here. I think you're mistaken. And he says, no, I've talked to Kurt Miller, who's the guy who interviewed me and hired me. You're staying within the mechanisms group, but you and I are switching positions. So I said, all right, well, let's go over to his office because I think you're making a big mistake here. So I go over to Kurt Miller's office, and they shut the door. And Kurt says, hey, meet this guy. Yeah, you and him are switching roles. And I ask why, but what's come up? And the guy who I'm switching with, I'm not going to give you his name because I understand the position he's in, and I should have probably done the same thing he did. He says that the project he's working on is a one-man job, and he doesn't know how to do it. The guy that was there before him didn't know how to do it and left, and he's very uncomfortable, but he's friends with the guy who's running the CIS, so he wants to be moved to that group, and they're moving me into this project. This was very much presented to me as not something I could really object to. Basically, I could throw a fit. I could say, no, I'm hired to do the CIS. I want to stay with that, but I'm not going to do that because of the implication. And the implication being, you work for me, and if we say we're going to move you, we're going to move you. And the implication was very much you move to this job or you don't have a job. It was very much implied to me that GHG had been made aware of this change and were completely okay with it, that I had nowhere to go to complain about this, basically. I didn't really want to complain about it, right? This is what I want to do my whole life. If they want me to do a different kind of system, fine. So I was introduced to the abort system to docking system, the ASDS. This was actually not a structural vibrations problem, which was very disappointing. It was just a series of rods that attached, like it says, the docking system to the abort system of the vehicle. And the purpose of it was, in the event of an abort, it would rip the docking system off, because the docking system being there prevented the crew from opening the door and getting out. So some cool aspects to it, but not nearly as technically challenging as the CIS. So the guy that I had switched with was very open. Kurt was also very open with me. He didn't know how to do this. He had done nothing on it. The previous guy didn't know how to do it, had done really nothing on it. So I'm going to be starting from scratch. So they sit me down. They do the same thing the CIS did. They gave me the presentation that they had used to walk through PDR. Again, there was no FEMAP for this. There was no finite element analysis done, but there were weights in this presentation to the hundreds of pounds. And I'm asking, how did you get these weights without calculations? And nobody would basically give you a straight answer on anything. So after a few days of this, I go back to Kurt and I say, look, I can probably do this. I'm confident I can do this. But nobody has given me any mentorship. Nobody has given me any guidance. I asked, what are my deliverables? What do you want from me? You want a CAD model? Do you want a finite element model? Do you want mathematical design? And they're like, we don't know, do the best you can. That was literally the phrase they said. We do not know, do the best you can. My supervisor was switched. Kurt Miller was still running the mechanisms group, but I was placed then under a man named Fred Renmark, who was a great guy, very friendly, very nice. But Fred had his own project. He made it clear to me that he didn't know what I was supposed to be doing or how to do it. And he was just sort of somebody that was there to help guide me. So I'm an extremely junior engineer. I've never done this stuff before. I'm hired into one spot. I'm immediately moved over to another spot and told, we don't have any guidance for you at all whatsoever. So I even asked her, what sort of software should I be using? And the only thing they told me is that the system's CAD model is something called Pro Engineer. So that's all. That's the sole advice I got. Imagine taking an engineer off the street and saying, design this space component. And I didn't know what I had to purchase versus what I had to design. I didn't know if I had to design something and have it manufactured. What's the process of getting quotes? What's the process of asking people things? When I was in college, I needed something designed. I would design it, go to the basement, to the shop, show it to the guy there and say, what's the best way to do this? What's the cheapest way to do this? How would you do this here with the machines that you have? We didn't have a shop there. So I'm kind of just on my own to guess how a shop would build things best, and no way to get any information whatsoever. So I kind of threw myself into it. For the next 9 or 10 months, I worked 60 plus hours a week. 3 nights a week, I would work my 8 to 5. I would go home and have dinner with my wife. We didn't have kids yet. And I would go back to the office and work 7:30 till 1 or 2 in the morning. 3 nights a week for 9 months. And I took this system from nothing, from years behind to ahead. And the way I did that was I started off and I said, okay, well, there's Power Technics at the bottom. I know I have to purchase those. I got with those people and said, how much, give me this, something that would hold this much weight. I started from there. I designed a fitting for that, designed rods from there on out, designed an entire system to retract these arms on a nominal launch and then blow and pull the docking system off on a off nominal launch. I had about 24 what we call MathCAD documents. And MathCAD was a software I had never heard of before. I had to go out and learn, that designed these things from the ground up, completely mathematical valid. If a requirement changed, all I had to do was change one of these numbers and everything filtered back down. I got along with everybody I worked with, including the guy whose role I switched with. I got a great deal of praise for the work that I had done and for the amount of time that I put in getting it done. There was absolutely nobody that wasn't thrilled with the work they had done, including Fred and Kurt. So I get done with this design. I go to them and say, is this good? Is this enough? What all am I supposed to be giving you? And they said, this is perfect. This is awesome. They said the next phase is going to be testing. And this particular project, the ASDS, was now a good bit ahead of where it needed to be. And I was kind of told to chill out for the next few years, which upset me because A, why did I have to just kill myself for 9 months if I'm going to spend a couple of years chilling out? B, I didn't really want to chill out. I came there to build a space vehicle, and they told me, hey, this project's going to take 15, 20 years, don't rush it. And I was like, well, supposedly we're 3 years away from launch at that point. So that was very off-putting. So I asked them, okay, well, let's go into testing. Am I going to be designing the test and the test structure? Yes. How do I do that? Again, we don't know. We got nothing for you. And what I told them was that, hey, I have designed this thing with absolutely no guidance, no mentorship, no help, no assistance, nothing whatsoever. And now I'm going to take it through testing under those same conditions. And if something goes wrong, everything is on me. And I'm literally not only the junior guy here, I'm the non-Lockheed employee here. And I was like, I need some help. I need some guidance. And I'm not comfortable moving forward without it. And they said, well, we don't have it for you. And these are supposedly engineers with 20 years of experience on NASA and Lockheed Martin projects. So I said, well, can you possibly move me somewhere where I can do my work or do some work with some guidance? And they were very upset about this. So I'm very upset. They understood why I was upset. Around this same time, there was a meeting that we had with our NASA counterparts. So NASA had people that would come and talk to us about our progress and making sure we were on schedule. These were not technical people either, but they hopefully could have understood the math. There was a thing that was done on the Orion very often that I called playing the game. And what this was is that when someone from NASA would come to you and say, okay, this part that you attached to has changed. It now weighs this much. You have to carry that much weight. That was how changes will always affect you, either the weight or a different connection point or something. That's not going to change the design of something like I've done that much. But what the people on the Orion project would do would throw their hands up and say, well, if this is changing, then the entirety of my project has to start over. And they would act as if I've done years of work and now it's all meaningless, which is bupkis. And I think everybody knew it, but everybody just sort of went along with it. I was in a meeting where the docking system added like 20 pounds. So it was like 270 versus 250. And they asked me, how long is this going to put you back? And I was like, I won't. So I'll go back to my desk. I'll change the numbers. I'll have the new weights and stuff for you by the end of the day. And the looks I got from the other Lockheed Martin people was quite frankly, screw this guy. Things changed almost overnight at that point for me. Nevertheless, I went to Kurt and said, hey, can I move somewhere else? And he said, hey, yeah, there's this other group called Hatches and Latches, and it's doors and the things that attach the doors to the capsule. It's run by a lady named Kim Kuykendall. Go talk to her and see if she's ready to build a testing structure, because I heard she's looking to hire an engineer. So she's right down the hallway. I'll go talk to her, explain to her the situation. She says, yes, we are looking to hire people. You sound like you'd be great for this. Let's make it happen if you're wanting to change. So great. I go back to Kurt and say, all right, well, let's get this started. Let's move you over there so I can get back to work. At this time, I'd been there a year. My yearly review was coming up. The way the yearly review was supposed to work was that I was given a form. There are 5 or 6 categories. You rate yourself on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the top rock star performers. Then you write out a list of all the things you've done that year. I made it clear that I've worked on this project 10 months, that 2 previous engineers had walked away from it, and that I took it from nothing to well ahead of schedule. Complete mathematical design, complete CAD model, a number of other things. And I gave myself a 5 out of 5. I think on everything except one, where I gave myself a 4 out of 5. That form is then supposed to go to Kurt Miller, my manager. He looks at it, writes his own sort of summary and evaluation. We talk about it. Then it gets sent to GHG, my subcontractor, and then I just go over there and sign it. That's how that process was supposed to work. What actually ended up happening was I get called by GHG. I go over there. GHG gives me a review, and nothing is written on this review in terms of like what Kurt thought I had done. There was a check mark by all 5 or 6 of the ranking systems. So Kurt agreed that I was a 5 out of 5 in all of these reviews. On the last page, there was a thing that just said comments, and it said, Josh has made his disdain for his job very clear. He's difficult to work with. Nobody wants to work with him. We're trying to get him switched, but nobody in any other groups wants to work with him. And I remember looking at that and going, what is this? And I remember looking at it again, and I said, wait a minute, he gave me a 5 out of 5 for attitude and behavior, and then says that nobody's willing to work with me. And they said, well, what did he say to you? And I said, well, he hasn't talked to me yet. I was like, I submitted this paperwork a few days ago, and you called me over here. And when I said he hasn't talked to me yet, the 2 ladies who was the names of Fernandez and Marzilli looked at each other and got extremely uncomfortable. And that made me uncomfortable. And I said, wait a minute, did he tell you that he talked to me about this review? And they said, well, we don't think we should talk about that. And I said, well, hold up, step back. You work for me, not for them. Like, I am your employee, technically. If you say you have a purpose here is to represent me. And I'm asking you, did he tell you he talked to me about this review? And again, they said, this is between you and him, end of story. And I said, all right, well, I'm going to go back to the office, and I'm going to talk to Kurt. And that's what I did. Walked right into Kurt's office. I said, hey, I just got called over to GHG for a review. There's some comments there. Can we talk about it? And he said, well, wait a minute, you and I haven't talked about your review yet. Why are you talking to GHG about it? And I said, well, yeah, that's the problem here. And he says, I haven't given them anything. I said, okay, well, then this is just a mistake. So Mars got crossed somewhere. Great, perfect. Let me know when you submit it to them. I go back to my desk. I email them, say, all right, I talked to him. It's all a mistake. He'll get the real stuff to you. A few days later, I get called back over to GHG, and they are emphatic. He says he told you he talked with you. He again reaffirmed these comments. And I said, okay, well, something's going on here. So I go back again to talk to Kurt. He says the same thing. Then I say, okay, GHG, me, and Kurt Miller need to get in the room and talk about this. And so we set up a time and date for a few days later. That day comes, and I go to Kurt Miller's office, which is where I'm supposed to meet with him and GHG. And instead of my GHG reps being there, which they had agreed to be there and said nothing to me about not being there, it's Kurt Miller and Kim Kugendahl. Kurt's office was decent size. He had a desk. He's behind the desk. There's 2 chairs that looked at his desk. Kim's in one of those chairs, and she says, have a seat, Josh. I've got my review with me. Kurt is pushed back from his desk, and his head is down sort of at his hands level, in his hands. And Kim proceeds to tell me, hey, we've talked about your review, and we're ready to move you over to my group. And I said, well, this is supposed to be a review talk between me and Kurt. I haven't talked with Kurt about my review yet. GHG is supposed to be here because apparently there's some communication issues. Kurt began to sink lower beneath his desk. And at this point, he's on the other side of his desk. He's pushed back from it, and his head is beneath his desk, and he's staring at the ground. And Kim is smiling at her ear, and she says, what's the issue with your review? And I said, well, you are not my manager yet. Like, this is between me and Kurt and GHG. And I realized nobody's going to talk to me about this. So I said, well, there were some comments in my review that are, quite frankly, not good. And Kurt says he didn't put them there. And she says, there's no comments there. And I said, what are you talking about? I said, I'm holding it in my hand. And she wouldn't take it. And she says, I've talked to GHG. Kurt and I just talked to them. Those comments are not present. Everybody here thinks you've done a great job. Everybody gets along with you. This is a mistake. Let's just move on and move you to my group. And I had a hope then that what had happened was that Kurt had gotten angry about me wanting to move and me wanting mentorship and guidance and basically saying you can't provide this for me. And he had written some stuff in my review which he regretted, and he didn't know how to walk it back. And the way he's behaving with his head beneath his desk made that appear normal. Unfortunately for me, there's nothing for me to do except this. There was a pattern of action at Lockheed Martin and quite frankly at NASA overall for things like this. What they would do is behave in these manners like this, put you in a situation that is patently absurd. And then when you rightfully respond by being very pissed off and yelling and screaming, maybe dropping some foul language, you are fired for that response with no discussion whatsoever of what got you to that response. I'd seen this happen a few times before. So I kind of thought, okay, maybe they're just asking me to do Curtis solid and move on. Maybe they're trying to goad me into yelling and screaming at a woman, especially, and fire me just for that. That way, they don't have to deal with anything that happened before. So I just told Kim, great, and I was moved to her group on paper at least the next day. I did go try to communicate with GHG again. In my initial communications for them, what I found out was that they were never even made aware that I had been switched out of my initial position. They had no idea what had happened, even though it was obviously communicated with me that they approved of it. I should mention something else at this time. We had what we called an analysis group. After I had done the analysis work for the ASDS, that group, the analysis group, was run by a man named Batsul Bolsura. He had at least one guy that worked for him who was a young guy with no advanced degree. That guy came over to me after he was made aware of these documents and was very flattering about them and said, hey, how did you learn to do this? Can you teach me how to do this? And he basically said, this is supposed to be our job in the analysis group, but we've never produced anything like this. And I said, well, you guys are probably finite element guys, right? Like that's what I wanted to do was analysis. And he said, no, I don't know anything about finite elements. He said, but I've seen that you've put in for a license and I've seen you've done this kind of work before. And he says, can you teach me how to do it? Because I'm supposed to do all these finite element analysis. And I kind of said to the guy, look, people go get a master's degree on this stuff and still not be very good at it. Finite elements is not something I can teach you how to do in a week or a weekend. It takes years to learn the theories, to learn the practice. And so that guy ended up getting switched to another group because he couldn't do the work. Part of the work there was the work that I had done. So you have two previous design engineers on the project that walked away from it, and I did it. An analysis group guy that walked away from the work, and I did it. In my time at NASA, I never saw a single thing produced other than a CAD model from anybody. Not the analysis group, not any of the design engineers. I didn't see a single piece of math. I didn't see a single finite element analysis, no thermal analysis, nothing. Again, this is the difference between technical people and non-technical people, because the vast majority of the people that I encountered there were non-technical people. Okay, so I get moved over to Kim Kukendall's group. I did not sign my yearly review. I made it clear to GHG that Kurt and Kim were emphatic that these comments were not on there, and I wasn't going to sign it. And they said, well, that's your right, and we're moving. They refused to talk to me about it anymore. This is a company I'm paying to represent me. It's taking a large portion of what should be my salary to represent me and refuses to even be in the room with me or talk to me. I can't really put into words what it's like to go through 4 years of military service, 7 years of school, and the conditions that I went through, just to go to a job like this where things are taken so unseriously, so pathetically, and managers with 20 years of experience are quite frankly literally hiding under their desk, and people are unwilling to talk to you. And I think if you're listening to this, what you're going to be saying is why didn't you go throw a fit? Well, like I said, you go throw a fit and you get fired for the fit. They don't care about what drove you to that. This is a tactic that they did. But I think what's more important to understand is that if you went to Kurt Miller or Kim Kukendall and said, how would you feel if somebody did this to you? How would you feel if somebody wrote something in a review and then said, oh, that's not there? That question would literally not make any sense to them, because from their point of view, they have rights to sue. They are legally protected. And they wouldn't say, well, this is abuse. What they would say is, well, you are not protected. and we didn't break any laws. There are no laws about lying to employees, or there are quite frankly no laws about lying about employees. As a white male, I am unprotected, and that's what they would say. They would say, well, I'm protected, so this can't be done for me. Almost as if, well, you deserve what happened to you because you had the audacity to be legally unprotected. So, all right, moving on, I go to work on the hatches and latches. Now, hatches and latches is doors and the things that attach the doors to the capsule. It's an entirely different group from Kurt Miller's mechanisms group. It's run by a lady named Kim Kuykendall, and she had someone who helped her named Paige Carr. After I was there for a day or two, they gave me the CAD model for the hatch, the door that they're working on. It was quite intricate, quite well done. And I thought, okay, well, there has to be math behind this for it to look like this. After a day or two, I was brought down to the basement of the building and shown in this little bitty room was the door of what I believe was a Gemini vehicle sitting on a wooden pallet. And I instantly saw that it matched the CAD model that I'd been shown. And Paige told me, yeah, so what we've done here is we've copied this door and we've upsized it because the door on the Orion is much, much larger. That's not an altogether terrible way to do things, right? You take what works and you adapt it to what you've done. You're learning from the past. Unfortunately, things don't scale linearly. Just because something is twice as big doesn't mean it's twice as much force. Usually it's much, much worse. The Orion vehicle is going to be in space a lot longer than the Gemini vehicle, and its door was much bigger. So that meant that the seal around the door had to be much denser so that it did not leak as much air. And there was more surface area for it since the door was bigger. These two things added up to mean that the amount of force it was going to take to close that door was significantly more than the design, and quite frankly, way more than any human being could exert. I was able to see this in a day or two, just quick, Excel-based calculations. After a few days more, I realized that they were completely aware that this was not a functional system. They didn't have the math to validate everything that they'd done, but somebody had figured this out and said, this is not going to work. They were sort of in a scramble to fix it. It had been a year and a half, 2 years, and all they had was a CAD model that they just developed off of a door in the basement. So I'm in this meeting. I'm like, okay, tell me how I can help here. I have to build a test fixture, but how do I do that when you don't actually have a door yet? I mean, you have one, but it's going to change. And they gave me this puzzled look, and they said, no, we've given you the CAD model. Start working on building a test structure that fits that. And I said, okay, well, the first thing I would obviously test is latching, unlatching. Like, how much force does it take? How many times can you do this without the mechanism failing? I said, as of right now, I've calculated, and it takes a great deal more force than the design. So right away, that's a fail even on math before you get to testing. And their response to me in this meeting was that if you have to figure these things out to do the test, then that's on you. That's sink or swim. That's the phrase they always used in that group. That's on you. You got to sink or swim in this thing. And I was like, whoa, it's not my job to design the hatch. It's my job to do the test structure and do the testing. If I have to design the latch, then put me on the latch. Give me credit for that. And they were like, no, the latch is still a work in progress. But if you have to solve these problems with the latch design to get the test to work, then that's what you do. And again, this is very much presented to me as a you have the right to say no, but you're not going to because of the implications. I kind of went and just walked around for several hours. Eventually, I went back to them and said, I'm willing to do this, but you're going to have to give me credit for it. It was at this time that somebody else from a different group came over. It was a guy I had water cooler discussions with about college football and stuff. And he asked me what had happened with the ASDS, and I sort of explained my review thing with him. And he said, well, do you know why they're so upset? And I said, no, quite frankly, I don't. And he said, well, there were two guys who worked on that thing in the past, and both of them didn't do anything. But what had been reported to NASA is that this thing was completely mathematically valid. Then you come in and you want credit for actually doing that math. Well, that put them in the spot where they either had to admit that, yes, we didn't actually do these things before, and Josh has done them now, so we're good now. Or they had to basically say that it was done before Josh got there, and Josh didn't do anything. So basically take my work and then blame me for the failure of that system. And I was like, well, it's not my fault that the previous guys couldn't do it. It's not my fault that they said it was done. So, I don't understand being angry at me, but not being angry at the two guys who refused to do any work and demanded to be put in a position where they didn't have to do any work. And the guy just kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, well, they're friends. So, he's not going to fire his friend. And that's that. So I said, they're asking me to do the same thing again. They're asking me to do the work that they're refusing to do. And he was just kind of like, yeah, that's kind of how this is. Now, if I was to tell this story to someone who is not involved in the space program, talk about how a manager gives a review and then denies it exists, talk about how they bring in other managers that back them up, they would be shocked. It is a horrifying thing that Kurt Miller can go to Kim Kuykendall, apparently, and say, look, I gave this guy a review. I lied in the review. I said he has a bad attitude. Nobody believes he has a bad attitude. I need you to come to this review to talk to this guy and lie to him and tell him it's not in there. And Kim Kuykendall was like, let's make it happen. That would be an astonishing thing for most people. In the space program, they would be astonished by it until you told them that I was a subcontractor. At what point they would be, oh, well, that sucks, but these things happen. That's just the life of a subcontractor. When I talk about the culture at NASA, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how you have Lockheed Martin employees that shield themselves from the competition of subcontracting people because they don't want to have to compete with somebody who can do work they can't do. You have NASA employees, civil servants, in that same position. They have all of these options, a great career path, and they don't have to compete with these thousands of other engineers who are stuck in contracting roles and the thousands and thousands of engineers stuck in subcontracting roles. It benefits everybody except subcontractors and the taxpayer, quite frankly, because you end up spending $30 billion over 19 years to pay for the careers of people who can't do anything. So I kind of start working on a test fixture and shooting some math stuff to the guys that are designing the hatch. Again, I go back to working 60-hour weeks because every time they make a change to the latch's CAD model, it blows up my CAD models because they didn't know how to do it without blowing it up. So the first few hours every day is reestablishing my CAD model and then getting to work on some math and stuff. It's difficult to describe what this environment was like. Unfortunately, Kim Kuykendall got sick. She had some sort of a surgery. It wasn't really explained to us, but she was gone for several months. Paige Carr was running things. The best way I can describe that environment was completely and totally dysfunctional. Paige would walk into every meeting, slam stuff down, and scream that people above her had no idea what they were doing, and everybody's an idiot, and then how she was constantly screaming. And when I say screaming, I mean screaming. Nobody works more than me. That was the phrase. Nobody works more than me, and everybody's got to sink or swim. And the reason she would do this is because if you went to her and say, hey, I'm stuck on something, hey, can you give me advice on this? And I'm not talking about being stuck on a math problem. I'm talking about, hey, I need to purchase some stuff, and I'm new to this. How does Lockheed go about putting out bids for purchasing? She's supposedly a manager with a decade of experience, and she has no idea how to do these things. So she just throws her hands up and says, I'm way too busy for this. And so I'm kind of going in circles. And eventually they decide, okay, this has gone too far. You need to start purchasing stuff for testing. And I said, I cannot purchase stuff for testing. We don't have a hatch yet. They wanted me to purchase a linear accelerator that was like $200,000. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that because the design of the latch is going to change and maybe this thing is not going to be useful anymore. And that kind of put a kink in everybody's problems because at that point they couldn't purchase these things that according to their schedule they should have been purchasing because at this point they're supposed to be done with the latch design and they're moving on to testing, but they're still doing the design. So they had to admit that the latch was a failure. So we have this meeting where they admit that it's failed. I had already kind of stopped working on the test design itself. I had gone to them and said, look, you got to give me something else to do here because this is not going anywhere. They said, all right, well, how about you start writing the software for the test? And I said, well, I can do that. I said, I'm extremely experienced in LabVIEW. LabVIEW is a language that I for my thesis, I took a wind tunnel that hadn't been used for a decade, took all the equipment out of it, put new equipment in it, and wrote all of that software to link everything together and drive it in LabVIEW. Just like a year of work. I'm confident that there's nobody in that building or probably at Lockheed at all in that area that was more experienced and proficient in LabVIEW than me. So what they did was they took a temp license, a student license, and put it not on my computer. They installed it onto a training computer in a basement room behind a locked door. And during the day, those computers were used for training, and I had to be there when that training was over, so they wouldn't shut the door on me, and then sit at the computer and write software at night. After a few days of this, I was able to figure out how to VPN into it, and I was able to do some work, but again, only after hours when it wasn't being used, and only as a student license. And I complained about this endlessly, and they just kind of laughed every time I complained about it. It was clear to me that they weren't going to let me do the work that needed to be done. So we have this meeting in which they say that the latch design has failed, and Kim was back. Paige is exclaiming that, like, how could this happen? So what had basically happened was the junior engineers didn't know how to do the design work. They were basically told, hey, here's a latch, make a copy of it, upscale it as much as we need, do a CAD model, and let's get going. When that didn't work, they didn't know how to do things mathematically. And they should have had a manager like Paige and Kim to go to guide them, to mentor them, to walk them through this process. And Kim and Paige didn't have that ability. They didn't do CAD, they didn't do fine element, they didn't do thermal, fluid, math, nothing. They're non-technical people. So you have junior engineers flailing, trying with nothing to do. So in this meeting, they say the latches have failed and we're going to have to start over again. And Kim and Paige said, heads are going to have to roll for this. And I'm kind of like, yeah, your head should roll. I mean, to myself, I didn't say this out loud. And this is the management style there. They said to a room of about a dozen, maybe 10 to 20 engineers, they said, if you think you haven't done a good job, but you can do a good job, you need to come talk to us now so that we can save your job. And in which case I'm sitting there thinking, okay, so if one of these engineers goes and talks to you, they're admitting that they haven't done a good job. Like, if you're the manager, you're supposed to know who has and hasn't done a good job. I didn't think it applied to me because, hey, this is the failure of a system that A, I didn't work on, and B, I was warning was going to fail. The fact that they had demanded that I do this work, despite it wasn't assigned to me, I was aware of it, but like I didn't think they would have the audacity to blame me for it. At the same time, I was called over to Balsora's desk. I had written all these documents designing the test structure itself to show that it could hold the load of a testing we were going to do on it. I'd written a couple for the hatch, but I wasn't going to get too involved in it. They were demanding that Vasul sign off on it. Now, these are documents Vasul and his group were supposed to be writing themselves, but again, I'm having to do it. So I take it over to him. He looks at it. Took about 15 minutes. He gets to one specific set of calculations that said, hey, you should look at hoop stress for this. And I'm like, well, it's not being stressed in that way. So it's going to be like orders of magnitude less. So I didn't worry about it. Well, he grabs a book and turns to hoop stress. I'm like, no, I know what it is. I have it in other places. You want me to put it in? It's fine. He says, yes, put it in. So I go back to my desk, add it in electronically, save the file, and walk away. A few hours later, Paige emails me again and says, hey, did Vasul sign off on that? I'm like, yeah, pretty much. He found one little issue. And she says, well, you got to go back to him and get it signed off. And I responded and said, these are designs for a test structure for a hatch, which you just said is failed and it's going to have to be done again. Why are we even wasting our time on this? And she says, you got to get him to sign off on it. So I go back over there. He looks at that equation and finds a typo. Now, I completely and totally admit I made that typo. It's there. Again, this is for a document that he's supposed to have written for a system that no longer exists. He starts screaming, and this was a tactic that I called public shaming. I had seen this done to other people. It hadn't been done to me yet. The office there was a huge room with cubicles about nose high, maybe neck high to me. So everybody could hear, loud conversations. Well, he starts screaming, Jesus fucking Christ, I wrote it down for you and you still got it wrong. At which point I realized, like, okay, now we've moved into the public shaming thing. And this was something he and other people would do to make it seem like, I'm just beset upon by all these buffoons around me. So he had a manager whose name I don't remember. I never even spoke to the guy that was a few steps down. I grabbed the paper. I'm like, we need to go talk to this guy because you're not doing this. And I stand up to leave. And he stands up, pounds his fist on his desk, picks up his keyboard, pounds his keyboard on his desk. He said, I wrote it down to you. You still fucking got it wrong. And storms off in the other direction. At which point I'm faced with the choice of do I grab him and force him into a coherent conversation with his manager? Do I call him out for what he's doing? If I scream, if I yell, if I respond in kind in any way, I'll be fired for that. I know it. He knows it. Everybody around us knows it. So there's nothing I could do. He leaves the building. I don't see him again. I don't think ever. A few days after this, I'm called over to GHG with no warning, no discussion, and I'm told that what I was told directly is they don't want to work with you anymore, and we don't have anywhere to send you, so we have to let you go. At which point I was like, well, did they give you a reason for this? And they said, we're not going to talk to you about it. And I said, I've been working 60 hours a week for these people. They don't even bother to give me a reason for it. Again, we're not going to talk to you about it. So when I was fired was 6 months and 1 day after my employee review with Kurt and Kim. I mentioned earlier that they maintain entirely separate policies for white male engineers. This is one of those policies. The policy is, you won't find it written down anywhere, but it's talked about everywhere. It's 6 months of no production was how they called it. I heard Kim and Paige talk about it all the time. Basically, if it's been 6 months and they say, well, he hasn't done anything in 6 months, they can fire you with no discussion, nothing. And on the day I left the ASDS, I was a 5 out of 5 performer, a top performer that had taken systems from way behind to way ahead. The next day, I was a zero producer, produced nothing for the next 6 months, and 6 months in 1 day after I'm a top producer, I get fired for 6 months of no production. Again, these are policies that can only be carried out on white males because in Texas, it's a right to work state, which means a white male can be fired for any reason with no warning. If someone other than that, someone that was legally protected, was fired in this manner, they could sue and say you violated your ethics policies, you didn't give me a warning, didn't give me anything because I'm black or because I'm gay or whatever reason. No company like Lockheed is going to step into a room and say, no, we didn't fire you because of your race. We fired you because we wanted you to do work you weren't assigned and not get credit for it, and you wouldn't do it, so we fired you. Of course they're not going to say that. So this is a policy that can only be carried out on straight white males. And so this kicked off a number of things. I filed for unemployment. We have what's called the Texas Workforce Commission that handles that. GHG denied my unemployment requests, and the Texas Workforce Commission said, hey, they said you were fired with cause. And I said, well, they didn't give me a cause. They wouldn't talk to me. What did they tell you? And they said, well, they gave us a review that had negative things about you. And they said that you were in a role and you couldn't do that role, so you were moved to another role, and you couldn't do that role, so you were eventually fired. And I said, did they give you any evidence of this at all? And the lady sent me the last page. She said, this is all they gave us. It was the last page of the review with the comments. None of the 5 out of 5 ratings. So out of a 5-page review, they gave the one last page. So I sent her the 5 pages of the review and said, hey, you realize there's no signature on that thing because I refused to sign it because my employer or my boss says it was not there. I explained the whole situation in the Texas Workforce Commission. They get back to GHG. GHG completely walks away from it. They say, okay, we're not going to challenge his unemployment. Let them have it. So I go back to the Texas Workforce Commission. I said, hey, these people lied to you, right? They sent you a review that was obviously false. And they said, yes. And I said, is that illegal? And they said, yes. I said, well, do I press charges? Can you press charges? And they said, nah, yeah, we're just, you got your unemployment. Be happy with that. Essentially, they're not going to call out a company whose sole existence is based on race because they fired a white dude and lied about the cause of it. But what I did learn from that was that GHG was saying that I had been deemed incompetent and then moved to another group and then deemed incompetent there, when in fact they knew and I knew that I was a 5 out of 5 employee. They knew that Kurt was refusing to admit that he made those comments. They knew everything that was going on and they were purposely lying about it. So I tried to follow a whistleblower act. Well, conveniently for NASA, subcontractors are not covered as whistleblowers. I tried to file an ethics report with NASA. Well, subcontractors are not fired. So NASA creates this system where a certain number of engineers have to work for these subcontractors and then says, well, whatever's done to you is none of our business. I mean, just because it's a NASA project and you're an engineer working on that project, you're not even a contractor, you're a subcontractor. So I did also file, like I said earlier, a complaint with the NASA Office of Inspector General, and they did do an investigation. They came and spent an entire day talking to me, writing down everything, took a copy of my review, a number of other things. That review apparently did not take long because a week or two later, they called me and said, hey, we've closed our investigation. We talked to NASA, we talked to Lockheed, we talked to GHG, and they do not deny a single thing that you've said. They admitted that these systems were not mathematically designed. They admitted that you did this work. They admitted that the failure of the latches had nothing to do with you. You didn't work on that. And so case closed. And I said, well, wait a minute, what about my job? And they said, your job is not our concern. They said, our concern is fraud. And fraud is lying to the Office of Inspector General. And since they did not lie to the Office of Inspector General, they did not commit fraud. And I said, well, what about bringing these systems through PDR with no math? And they said, well, that's between Lockheed and NASA. And I kind of understand that. But so again, they got caught at every step along the way here. Every single step along the way. They got caught by the Texas Workforce Commission. They got caught by the NASA Office of Inspector General. They admitted to these things. And yet I have no legal basis whatsoever to protect myself. I can't. My name within the community at NASA is completely and utterly destroyed, and I don't even get to know what accusations were made about me. They could have said that I assaulted a female. They could have said that God knows what, and I don't even get to be made aware of those things. I'm just assuming that they said that the failure of these systems was my fault, even though I didn't work on them. I also filed an ethics complaint with Lockheed Martin, and that went about as well as you can expect. I'm sure if you're listening to this, you might think, why you could have filed this ethics complaint at any point in time. Lockheed Martin is not going to go with a subcontractor against multiple managers with decades of experience. It is not going to happen. So after I was fired, I was like, well, I might as well just file a complaint and see what happens. So I filed a complaint. A few months later, they got back to me. They were pretty open. They did not talk to anyone. They did no investigations. I gave them names of people within the group that I knew were equally unhappy, people that would vouch that had nothing to do with these failures, people who complained endlessly about Paige and Kim. I begged them to go speak with them. I begged them to take a look at my review, to look at my badging of the hours I was working, going in and out of that building. But they didn't. They were open that they did none of that. At that point, I began to ask, well, I don't even have a reason as to why I was fired. And she said, well, they said you had a bad attitude. And I think we've seen some of that here today. And I was like, wait a minute, you're saying I have a bad attitude because I'm upset that you didn't do an investigation? And I was like, you didn't look at anything. You didn't ask any questions. You didn't take a single thing I said seriously. And at this point, the young lady who was the ethics officer begins to interrupt me, screaming, oh well, oh well, oh well, oh well, over and over again, as if we were complaining about a fast food order, or as if I'm at a nail salon and I'm upset about the work she's done. This is my career. This is how I provide for my family. Like I said, I did 4 years in the service to get to go to college, and 7 years of college under very difficult circumstances, and my career is treated with the seriousness of nothing, with oh well, oh well, oh well. This was by far and away the most degrading experience of my life, and I'm saying that as someone who, as part of my training, was stripped virtually naked, beaten, put into a box, and soaked with a hose. That was nothing compared to this. Those things are designed to make you feel as if you're less of a person. What this did for me was show me I don't have rights. The country I serve doesn't believe I should have equal rights as other people. Where those people should be legally protected, I should not be. Where those people might have a right to work and to get the results of their work in both money and rewards, I am obligated to work for a company. I'm obligated to have so much less of a career where I cannot climb a ladder because I have to work for this subcontracting company and give them a portion of my wage. That is what it means to be a white male engineer at NASA. That is by far and away the largest reason why NASA is failing. I don't think you can fix this culture. I don't think you can fix these problems, but you sure as heck can't fix them without addressing this DEI problem. I think the way that you do that is you have to end subcontracting immediately. You have to apologize to the generations now, decades of white male engineers that have had to work for these companies that for significantly lesser pay with zero ability to get a promotion. You have to apologize to the numbers of white male engineers that came into NASA expecting to do great things that are extremely, and I mean extremely skilled, and then left the industry to go build windmills and to go to do other things. I went to college with people who, quite frankly, were the smartest people I've ever met in my life, and they left the space program very quickly after seeing that there is no future for them there, and that's unfortunate. And it is the reason why NASA is having the problems it's having on the Orion and in other places. There is a reason why SpaceX is vertically landing rockets and Orion is at 19 years and $30 billion and can't duplicate technology from the 70s. And that reason is because of all of the non-technical people. In a legitimate company, a legitimate NASA system, like I described earlier, you are paying me to do a job. I have a manager. I have maybe people that work for me. I have people I can go to if I have concerns. Technically, people with experience. You are paying me. You're paying them. They're producing. I'm producing. The way it is set up at NASA now, I'm doing the technical work. Other subcontractors are doing the technical work. For each one of us doing the technical work, you have multiple non-technical people whose sole job it is to shuffle the paperwork back and forth between me and the NASA counterpart, who's also not a technical person. So you have Lockheed people, NASA people, all of these people, plus you have the subcontracting company itself. All of those people have to make a living off of my salary, off of my work, and they themselves are producing nothing for this. That's why these things cost so much money now and take so much time. You've lost that institutional memory, and you have all of these people making a living off of work, and these people have no business doing this. It's upsetting and it's disgusting, and I'm not sure it can be fixed. My hope from this is that the next NASA administration head who has not been approved yet would be asked these questions, asked how he feels about these subcontracting programs based on race, ask if he's willing to go along with them or cancel them, and quite frankly asked, if subcontracting is so great, why aren't you a subcontractor? Because that's what they'll all say. It's like, oh, it's not that bad, but they'll never do it themselves. I think that's all that I have. There was one other metric. If you don't understand how bad things have gotten in NASA, if you take the entire amount of money given to a project and the total amount of time for a project, you get a pretty good judge of how much resources NASA has invested into that project. So you multiply the amount of time times the amount of money, and you get a number. And that number will show you how much time and money they've devoted for it. For Mercury, you're at about 5 years and around $3 billion, so that number is 15. Gemini, you're at 5 years and $10 billion, so that number is 50. For Apollo, you're at 11 years total and $43 billion. So you're about 475. That's a huge number. That's billions of dollars times years. SpaceX, you're at about 30 to 40. Boeing, 10 years and $5 billion. You're only at 50. For the Orion, you're at 19 years and $30 billion. So you're over, that number for Orion is over 570. Again, for Apollo, now this is just the capsule. We're not talking about the rest of the program. This is just money on the capsule. That number is 475. And for Orion, that number is over 570. So you've already invested more time and money into the Orion capsule than you did the Apollo capsule. And out of that Apollo program, you got like a dozen structural vehicles built and 10, 12 actual missions flown. You haven't launched one manned mission yet for Orion. And you've built a couple of test ones, and you're building one that will eventually fly. You had the unmanned flight earlier. So this isn't even a question of, is this program successful? It's simply the amount of failure that's gone on. I appreciate you listening to this. I know it was a long rant. I wish there was more I could do. I wish I could make this video production-wise a lot better. Unfortunately, I just don't have the time to do that. I've had to reinvent my career and do other things with my life now that my NASA career was cut off. I wish I could do this a little bit better, but I thank you for listening to it. It's over an hour long now. Again, my name is Joshua Foxworth. If you want to reach out and talk about this, if you're thinking about taking a subcontracting job, my advice for you is don't. If you are interviewing for one, you should tell your Lockheed, Boeing, SpaceX, whatever it is, counterpart that like, hey, I'm good enough to be hired. So, yeah, thank you.